everybody. We are back together to go through some articles. I haven't read these yet. Some of them I've looked at briefly, but I figured we would go over them together like we've done over the last little while. And some of you, when I asked for your opinion about these live streams, if you don't mind us going over the articles, you said it's okay, you'd like more of my opinion, more analysis. So we'll see. I have other videos where I go into detail on some things, but I just want to read these together and we'll comment as we go through them. What we're looking at here is, why is the right so unattractive? I'm not sure you can see that whole title. Let me try to put that. There you go. Why is the right so unattractive? There's a reason disenchanted liberals won't switch sides. Article by Douglas Murray that some people were circulating on Twitter, and I thought we should have a look to see what Mr. Douglas Murray has to say. Political tribes enjoy attacking their opponents. It's what they do. Far less appealing is the idea of applying the same criticism to your own side. No doubt this stems from a desire not to give ammunition to one's political enemies. Air your dirty ideological linen in public, and it's likely your opponents will draw attention to it. By the way, you probably have seen that there's a kind of infighting among conservatives, Republicans, people on the right, where on one hand you have the paleo-conservative based so-called, to the right of neoconservatism cohort or group. And then you have people like Douglas Murray, Barry Weiss, and more mainstream IDW type figures. There's some infighting going on there. So I guess this is going to be speaking to that to an extent. So still there are times when a refusal to engage in self-criticism can be a hindrance to your tribe, as both the American right and left are now discovering. Since 2016, the American left has desperately cut itself off from reality. Its unwillingness to concede that Donald Trump won the election precluded the Democrats from being able to consider why their candidate lost. But the American right, Douglas Murray writes, is equally capable of deluding itself. In fact, with Biden in the White House, it is now as much a problem for the American right as it was for the left during the Trump years. What do you think? Is there a right-wing equivalent to the Russiagate hysteria that is as bad, as egregious, as mainstream, and as thoroughgoing as that was? Maybe you think so. Absent any self-reflection, political tribes are condemned to return to the same question. What is it about their opponents that makes them so belligerently wrong? This is why Democrats and Republicans responded to the 2016 and 2020 elections in a similar fashion. What on earth was there to dislike about Hillary Clinton? What could possibly be said against the character of Donald Trump? So in other words, each side is so sure that its candidate is the right one that they can't imagine anybody thinking otherwise, absent some crazy conspiracy. Sometimes, however, this lack of self-criticism is more profound. Toward the end of last year, I was invited to speak at the National Conservatism Conference in Orlando, Florida. Do any of you know about the National Conservative Conference? I think there have been two now. If you attended, if you read about any of the people who were in attendance, and if you've seen what the project or program was of National Conservatism, you can write that in the chat and in the comments to what extent you think they're onto something and to what extent you think they're off the mark. Yoram Hazony, one of the major organizers, I think he's the major organizer of this conference, has a book on nationalism, virtues of nationalism, worth reading and thinking about. In my view, a nice juxtaposition between Hazony and Dugin. You can stage one because Hazony defends nation states, whereas Dugin defends what he calls Großraum, large territories, great spaces, civilizational пространство. Being, as I told one of the organizers, only about 2/3 in agreement with the conference agenda, I didn't feel it was my place to give a speech. Douglas Murray continues. So instead, I took part in an interesting panel discussion with Ruben Amari and the conference's convener. Here you go, Yoram Hazony. Was just mentioning him, and we have something lined up, by the way, to read together by Amari as well. It was a rich discussion, but we passed over too lightly a subject which demands serious focus. At one point during the panel, Dave brought up the popular talk show host Bill Maher. In recent years, Maher has singled himself out on the American left for his willingness to criticize the excesses of his own political side, in particular, cancel culture and the cult of woke. Dave suggested that given how much Maher agrees with conservatives on these points, it's strange that he still identifies with the left. In other words, why should he not come over and join the merry men of the right? You may have also heard people make that argument to Brett Weinstein, saying that given his position, he belongs naturally on the right and not on the left as he sees himself or where he places himself. There are a number of possible answers to this question. The first, which many conservatives would offer, while no doubt patting themselves on the back, is that Maher somehow lacks the bravery or courage needed to commit such an act of apostasy to cross the aisle from left to right. He may have moved rightwards, but he's not willing to concede as much. The second answer, which I imagine Maher himself might offer, is that he hasn't left the left has left him. He has stayed precisely where he was and remains as true to his principles as ever. There is perhaps some truth here, but this still fails to address the key question. Why, in the face of the current leftist orthodoxies, are so many on the traditional left reluctant to admit they now have more in common with the right? You guys know of examples of people who are on the left who now seem to have more in common with the right than with the left, and the people on the left accuse them of being too sympathetic to the right. You see that to a certain extent with Joe Rogan, probably with Glenn Greenwald as well. After all, previous generations of American public figures had no problem with making a move from left to right and admitting as much. Both Irving Kristol and Norman Podhoretz, and you could say neoconservatism as an intellectual movement, flirted with Marxism or Trotskyism before coming out for conservatism. British public life is also peppered with individuals who made similar journeys without any embarrassment. Malcolm Muggeridge, Paul Johnson, and Kingsley Amis, to name but three. Yet, in America today, such apostasy is almost heard of. There have been semi-regular defections from the right, especially during the Trump era when people such as Max Boot broke publicly with their own side to support a Democrat president, but there's a glaring absence of any movement in the opposite direction. Can you guys think of anybody in the mainstream, well-known, who used to identify with the left and explicitly moved over to the right, considered themselves now on the right? Bill Maher, Barry Weiss, and a slew of other liberals who have fallen out with their own tribe have chosen not to identify as conservative. And that should be a cause for concern, Murray continues. Rather than ignoring this trend, conservatives need to ask themselves, what is it about the right that is so unappealing that people who agree almost entirely with its views resile? Is that a word? I don't think I've ever seen that. Is that a typo or is that just a word? I don't know. Resile, abandon a position or course of action. Well, there you go. Where are we here? They resile from joining its ranks. Had you ever seen that word before? Resile? Don't kid yourselves. It's like limb, L-I-M-N. You don't see that very often. Resile. Okay, so the question he's asking is this. You have leftists who are apoplectic at the direction the left has taken, and they're increasingly taking positions like those on the right, and yet they don't identify with the right. And Douglas Murray is asking, what is so obnoxious on the right that leftists like this are not willing to identify themselves with the right? Okay, that's the question, that's the problem. By the way, hello to those of you who are here. Nice to see you, quote unquote. As it happens, Douglas Murray continues, I suspect one of the answers to this question can be found in one of the speeches given at the National Conservatism Conference. During his talk, the distinguished conservative scholar Patrick Deneen, author of the book Why Liberalism Failed, and I do not say this to do him any injustice, he offered a lament for the 50s, for the change in people's habits of dress, manners, and sexual etiquette. I listened to all of this with great interest and considerable disagreement. But as I did so, I could not help thinking that here in a nutshell was the main reason why disenchanted liberals like Maher would never in a million years join the American right. All political and social movements have their own oddities and obsessions. Many of the obsessions of the American right, however, are too illiberal to possibly win over anyone but that type of person who jumps political sides, boots and all, because they favor the political certainty of its all-encompassing ideological home. Why won't thoughtful ex-liberals consider joining the right? Well, perhaps it has something to do with the type of conservative they'd be associated with. Let's just read this, because somehow, so far, the main thesis. So far, and again, you can let me know in the chat, in the comments, what you think about this claim. So let's have it again. Many of the obsessions of the American right are too illiberal to possibly win over anyone but that type of person who jumps political sides because they favor the political certainty of its all-encompassing ideological home. What liberal or former liberal would want to find themselves in an ideological movement in which opposition to the right to abortion, opposition to no-fault divorce, and nostalgia for the era before the invention of the pill are commonplace? Like he's arguing, there's no bridge that'll get a former liberal across an abyss so wide that'll have them on the other side with these deeply conservative positions on the right. This isn't to say that the conservative movement in America should not make these arguments. They can make them as much as they want, but they can hardly be surprised if others outside their flock refuse to join them as a consequence. At the heart of this lies a centuries-old tension in America between the worlds of politics and religion. It was always said that the genius of keeping religion in the background during the founding of America was that it allowed it to flourish in the foreground later on. By contrast, the centrality of the established church in England almost guarantees the obscurity of religion's place in public life. Douglas Murray continues. And yet, in America, the desire on the right to mix religion and politics remains a significant temptation. By the way, those of you who don't know, there's a nice phrase about term about the link between philosophy and, politics and religion, also relates to philosophy. It's the theological, political, or political theology. These phrases that bring together these two domains, religion and politics. So here he's saying, there's too much political theology on the right. There's too much of a temptation to link and combine and mix religion and politics. The National Conservatism Conference, that's that Hazony-led effort that has met 2 times now, I think, was filled with a disproportionate amount of Catholic social doctrine. And it's not the first time I've observed this encroachment. Most gatherings of conservative intellectuals fracture along this same line. The Vandenberg meetings, don't know what those are. Let's pull that up maybe for later, fell into this problem at the start of the last decade. And I was once at a meeting of conservatives on the continent where on several occasions an American participant gleefully referred to gay couples as being in, quote, sodomitical relationships, unquote. Should we be surprised that so many liberals instinctively revile conservatism? So how can you extend a hand across the divide between liberals and conservatives, Douglas Murray is arguing, when there's just nothing in common? And these elementary, you could say, liberal conservative positions, like in support of gay marriage and free market liberal conservatism, are being displaced by a more Catholic social conservatism or a different kind of political theology. All of which is to say that this overlap between politics and religion remains a special type of kryptonite to any separation of church and state liberal. And that would be a subject of niche interest, were it not also for the fact that it is electorally disastrous for the American right. So first, I'm just going to throw this question out for those of you who are active in the chat and in the comments. Do you agree with this claim that Catholic social conservatism, this anti-liberal conservatism of the non-neoconservative right, is electorally disastrous? Again, that would be a subject of niche interest were it not also for the fact that it's electorally disastrous for the American right, however enjoyable it may be as a religious or intellectual enterprise. As many as 3 in 10 American adults are now religiously non-affiliated. Fewer than half of Americans belong to a religious congregation. In such a world, the idea that a conservative movement can succeed while being intrinsically tied to religion, let alone one particular denomination, is a steer into the political wilderness. Guys, I know you don't see thumbs downs anymore on YouTube, but I just got one. Hopefully that's a thumbs down for the argument or voicing your disagreement with the claim and nothing against the stream. Because of course, YouTube's a big place. You could just go somewhere else. After all, why would people who share 95% of your political attitudes not wish to join you? More often than not, the answer is not because of any lack of fortitude, but because of that 5% of beliefs you had hoped they might overlook. Perhaps that small portion of ideas, Douglas Murray continues, is worth fighting for, perhaps even to the extent that it's worth alienating would-be conservatives. But these are questions the right needs to answer rather than blaming liberals for pointing them out. Okay, this is this article right here. Why is the right so unattractive? Meaning, why is it unattractive to liberals who seemingly So I know you don't really see that fully on the screen. Let me just fix that for you. That means why is yeah, I'll just leave it. Why is the right so unattractive for liberals who seem like they might want to go to the right? Okay, I'm going to take a minute here and pop over to the chat. Again, thanks those of you who are here. It's always nice to have somebody and not to be all by my lonesome. So here's Cerebral Fiction, writes Douglas Murray is always spot on, taking the position of Murray in this analysis. And Jay ends with the comment that Murray didn't look good at all in his recent Twitter spat with Pedro Gonzalez at Emeriticus. So it's actually through Pedro Gonzalez's Twitter that I saw this piece by Douglas Murray. Those of you who want to get into the back and forth between Pedro and Douglas, Pedro representing somebody who is part of the, I guess, obnoxious right from Douglas's point of view. Yeah, that's right. So Gonzalez made some jokes about a member of the Rothschild family. And not only Murray pulled the anti-Semitism card, but was there not another? Was that Murray who put out the other article as well against Pedro, or who went on the attack against him? Maybe it was. Patrick, great to see you. And again, just thanks everybody for being here. Okay, let's go to the next article. Let me make sure now to take that comment off the screen. How far we've come since the last stream where I didn't know how to do that. We'll skip that for now. Okay, we have some things on Russia queued up, but let's not go there yet. There's this thread that you may have seen on Twitter that I wanted to share with you because it was quite good. Mr. Jadrul, who is he here? Educator, singing animal doctor, Argentine tango enthusiast, do nothing pirate, solar powered life form, water, buffalo advocate, and Christian Isaiah 1:8. So you should let me know what you think about this as we go through it. He writes, things are going to fall apart because we're wasting our top talent. Almost all of the smartest guys I knew in college, guys who would have governed colonies in the 19th century, are working email jobs or programming at a Tinder for Dogs startup. In Victorian England, the young elite would be sent to govern colonies of thousands of people, rewrite laws, plan railways, settle local disputes, learn an entirely foreign culture. And for the most part, they succeeded. Young classics nerds ruled the earth. On the American frontier, you can move out to a brand new town and instantly be at the top of your field. Judges and lawyers and doctors all in their 20s. The richest man in town, the local monopolist, just pushing 30. For most of human history, the elites brought their children along with them to learn how to rule. Plato wanted the warrior class witnessing battles from childhood, as you can read about in the Republic. If you go to platocourse.com, I have a course on the Republic. The British Navy had a good stock of children on all their ships. Now, if you're a student coming out of a good college, what are your options? Make Candy Crush more addictive? Make 200 slides a week consulting at Bain, copy and paste documents in contract law? We have this huge filter: ace high school, ace the SAT, crush college and the LSAT. We identify people in the top percent of the top percent and then have them literally send emails reminding the client to sign the PDF of the document when these men could rule cities. And it happens at a lower level too. My town government is missing like 5 key employees, planner, building inspector, police chief, that stuff, because of labor shortage, but they won't even think of hiring someone under 40. I'm on a town board, so I told my buddy to apply for town work since he's from here and has a useless degree in German lit and he could push paper just fine. They didn't even give him a call back. No thought of how we could potentially use a smart young guy in town government. They only want to hire some boomer from 3 towns over with 20 years experience doing government work in a slightly smaller municipality. But every dang one of them got hired as an office in the 80s and got promoted because the town government grew. Meanwhile, all these boomers who have been there 40 years, teachers or coordinators or whatever, are pulling 6 figures and a pension when they could hire my buddy for half that. You could cut costs in half by adding a physical fitness requirement to keep out the old. Finally, a lot of my good friends are now spending their mental and physical prime. Maybe some of you are in your mental and physical prime. Sending emails or copy pasting documents in exchange for stupid but not insane amounts of money, hundreds of thousands but not millions. You're going to die sooner than you think. Don't waste your life. Okay, an interesting thread gives us something to think about. Again, the key idea here: things are going to fall apart because we're wasting our top talent. Is that true? What do you think about that claim? your 20, 30-year-old German lit classics buddy who could have governed a colony back in the days is now programming at a Tinder for Dogs startup for decent but not amazing money. Okay, well, we need to have talent at the top. We need to have competence and expertise. We need to have people who know what they're doing. Otherwise, you get chaos, like we're going to see soon in Ukraine. All right, so that was that. And speaking of Ukraine, here's another thread I wanted to have a look at. This one with you for the first time. Just popping over to the chat, though, for a minute. Let's see here. Okay, let's just take a moment in the chat before we go to the next thread. Again, those of you who are here, appreciate it. Good to be with you. I like this format, going over articles, going over threads, commenting as we go along. I'd be doing it on my own anyways. Might as well do it together with you. Jay here writes that the right doesn't need to broaden its constituency for now. As it stands, it's utterly unfit to rule and needs to build a strong core first. Julius, if there's any right in America, it's pretty milquetoast. The right should have a spiritual orientation, be hierarchical, etc. And I have another look at this comment. The right has an opportunity right now to broaden its constituency if the hardcore gatekeeper doesn't mess it up, doesn't screw it up. Definitely some things to consider. The future of the right as it breaks away from neoconservatism. All right, over to this thread by Clint Ehrlich. You can follow him on Twitter. You see the Twitter handle there. The conventional wisdom is that we're headed for a second Cold War with Russia. I disagree. We're flirting with a hot war. Yeah, I would say Putin definitely has all the cards right now, and he can definitely win some major gains if he decides to take action, and we have good reason to think that he will take action. It could involve nukes, billions of people could die, thread. All right, let's have a look and see what the claim is here. Just like before the Iraq war, there's a pro-war lobby pushing Biden to attack Russia. They want to put together a quote-unquote coalition of the willing. Russia will be attacked if it does not surrender the territory it acquired in 2014, which anybody who knows anything knows will never happen. The call for war is not coming from fringe people in lonely corners of the internet. That op-ed here at Defense One, and maybe we'll just open it up and read it, is from Obama's Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. She says that we should, if necessary, prepare for war with Russia. I think we're going to read it. Let's see here. Is this super long? Well, this is Evelyn Farkas, January 11th, 2022. The U.S. must prepare for war against Russia over Ukraine. You really got to wonder about American geopolitical and foreign policy incompetence. If Putin is not deterred from seizing another chunk of sovereign territory, he won't stop there. President Vladimir Putin is more likely than not to invade Ukraine again in the coming weeks. As someone who helped President Barack Obama manage the U.S. international response to Russia's initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and our effort to keep Moscow from occupying the whole country into 2015, I'm distressingly convinced of it. Why? I see the scale and type of force arrayed by the Russian military. You can read the details of that in various articles from the last week or two. The ultimatums issued by Putin and his officials, the warlike rhetoric that has until recently saturated Russian airwaves, and the impatience with talks expressed by his foreign minister, the one and only. Add to that the likely anxiety produced in Putin by the demonstrations last week in Kazakhstan and Moscow's success in tamping them down. But the basic reason I think talks in Russia will fail, Evelyn Farkas writes, is that the United States and its allies have nothing they can immediately offer Moscow in exchange for de-escalation. In other words, all the cards are in Putin's hands. All of them. The United States must do more than issue ultimatums about sanctions and economic penalties. U.S. leaders should be marshaling an international coalition of the willing, readying military forces to deter Putin, and if necessary, prepare for war. That's, is that what he was quoting there? The coalition of the willing, and here, if necessary, prepare for war. But let's just finish this article. If Russia prevails again, we will remain stuck in a crisis, not just over Ukraine, but about the future of the global order, far beyond that country's borders. Yeah, that's what Russia's concerned about, is the global order. in particular about NATO's presence on their border in the global order. Left unrestrained, Putin will move swiftly, grab some land, consolidate his gains, and set his sights on the next satellite state in his long game to restore all the pre-1991 borders. The sphere of geographical influence he deems was unjustly stripped from Great Russia. The world will watch our response. Any subsequent acceptance of Russian gains will spell the beginning of the end of the international order. Who is celebrating that prospect and who is dreading it? If Europe, NATO, and its allies in Asia and elsewhere fail to defend the foundational United Nations principle of sanctity of borders and state sovereignty, which obviously nobody respects more than the United States, no one will. Any appeasement will only beget future land grabs, not only from Putin, but also from China and Taiwan and elsewhere. And if the world's democracies lack the political will to stop them, the rules-based international order will collapse. The United Nations will go the way of the League of Nations. We will revert to spheres of global influence, unbridled military and economic competition, and ultimately world war. Restated, the world will become multipolar and no longer American. Yes, this is alarming, but it's not alarmist. We should be alarmed. Nuclear Russia is a revisionist, revanchist power acting already as if there's no international order or United Nations, ignoring the Geneva Conventions, UN Charter, Helsinki Accords, or any of the host of regional agreements Moscow has signed. Let me just double check here that we're not getting ourselves into too much reading on this article. Let me see. What should we do? Should we pause this article, go back to Clint's thread? Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. Let's pause Clint's article. So he linked to this one right here. The U.S. must prepare for war against Russia over Ukraine. I think you're getting a gist of it. Okay, if need be, we can go finish it later, but let's go on. The call for war is not coming from fringe people in lonely corners of the internet. That op-ed that we were just reading is from Obama's Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. She says that we should, if necessary, prepare for war with Russia. Farkas, there you go. Under what conditions would war be necessary? If Russia does not end its illegal occupations of Ukraine and Georgia, obviously never going to happen. In other words, Russia must respect our version of international law or we attack. Quote, we must not only condemn Russia's illegal occupations of Ukraine and Georgia, but we must demand a withdrawal from both countries by a certain date and organize coalition forces willing to take action to enforce it. Seems like a pretty crazy thing to do. The problem is that the territory Russia acquired in 2014 includes Crimea. The Russia hawks claim that is the problem. Because we let Putin have Crimea, he's now demanding more. They want to roll back, quote unquote, Russia from that territory, quote, even at the risk of direct combat. What do you think? Should Americans and American allies go fight Russia and die to roll Russia back from Crimea, from Georgia, from Donbass? That's not even, from anywhere where it has any stake, interest, influence. This is a far more aggressive strategy than the US pursued during the Cold War. America primarily employed a containment strategy, as I described in my thread on George Kennan. It never tried to roll back Russia inside the Soviet Union itself. And you see this previous thread by Clint about George Kennan and the policy of containment. In this instance, direct combat could easily escalate to all-out nuclear war. From Russia's perspective, this coalition of the willing would be invading its homeland. The Kremlin views Crimea as just as much a part of Russia as Moscow. Just to remind you of the thread, we're doing Clint's thread here. The conventional wisdom is that we're headed for a Cold War. I disagree. We're flirting with a hot war, and it could involve nukes. Pick your battles. You're going to have a nuclear war with Russia because you want to displace them from Crimea. You want to displace them from Georgia. Get real. If this is in the heads of any American analysts, they should go get their heads checked. My summary of the Russian government's attitude towards the territory is not an understatement. It is informed by my time as a visiting researcher at MGIMO, where I had the opportunity to speak to Russian officials and strategists. Let us assume, for the sake of argument, that war advocates are correct, that their anti-Russia coalition would have conventional superiority. The question is whether Russia would use nuclear weapons to defend its territory. It's the official policy of the Russian Federation that certain conventional attacks deserve a nuclear response. Specifically, Russia has retained the right to use nuclear weapons against conventional attacks that threaten the existence of the state. Now, the document that he's quoting here is employment of the armed forces, other troops and bodies, and their main tasks in peacetime under the conditions of an imminent threat of aggression and in wartime. And we're going to paragraph 27, this highlighted phrase, in the event of aggression against the Russian Federation with the use of conventional weapons when the very existence of the state is in jeopardy. In that situation, the Russian Federation shall reserve the right to use nuclear weapons in response to that aggression. In response to a successful invasion, Russia could interpret this policy as allowing it to use nuclear weapons to defend Crimea. The technical legal criterion would arguably be met, and even if it weren't, the policy could be stretched. It's useful to consider what the US would do under similar circumstances. Imagine if Russia invaded Texas and defeated the US military conventionally. Would we give up our land, or would we use our most powerful weapons to defeat the hostile occupiers? There are other scenarios short of a US attack on Crimea that could also spark nuclear war. Russia is already threatening to deploy forces to Venezuela and Cuba. Guys, if you're reading this, by the way, you're listening to me here, don't worry. America does not make foreign policy blunders or military mistakes. Our experts don't err. So don't worry. We're reading hypotheticals. There are other scenarios short of a US attack on Crimea that could also spark nuclear war. Russia is already threatening to deploy forces to Venezuela and Cuba. The goal would be to impose costs on the US comparable to the NATO threat in Ukraine. And by the way, as you see, there are people who support countering Russia if it does anything in Ukraine, to Ukraine. Okay, let's continue on with the thread here. There are other scenarios short of a U.S. attack on Crimea that could spark nuclear war, as we saw here, deploying forces to Venezuela and Cuba, imposing costs on the U.S. comparable to the NATO threat in Ukraine. We're not going to click through to the article. You guys should definitely do so when you look at the threads on your own. This would effectively be a repeat of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Most people have no idea how close we came to global nuclear war during the original crisis. It was a fluke that the planet wasn't destroyed. This time, we might not be so lucky. When the Soviet Union deployed missiles to Cuba, America imposed a quarantine of the island. It didn't matter that Moscow was responding to U.S. missile deployments in Turkey and Italy. The Navy was authorized to attack any Soviet ship that refused to be searched. Depth charges were dropped on a Soviet submarine, B-59, which was armed with nuclear torpedoes. The captain and the political officer voted to fire one of those weapons in retaliation. It is widely agreed that if this command had been executed, global nuclear war was likely. The two votes would ordinarily have been enough to launch the attack. That is the votes of the captain and political officer. But by chance, the Soviet flotilla's chief of staff was also on board B-59. He voted against launching the nuclear attack. The others listened and extinction was averted. To a sane person, this incident shows how close the world came to complete annihilation during the Cold War. It was pure luck that prevented the conflict from going hot and crossing the nuclear threshold. If we recreate the same scenario, we may easily get a different result. But don't worry, because you can just have a margarita. If that happens, just take it easy, relax, and have a margarita. On its own, that evidence would be enough to make us take the risk of nuclear war seriously. But there's an added dimension of urgency due to probability theory and computer models. They discredit the main argument debunking nuclear war. What is that argument? It's that because prior crises with Russia didn't trigger nuclear war, this one won't either. Here's a typical obnoxious example of this line of thinking. We didn't die then, so we'll be safe now. You see international relations PhD making an argument along those lines. It neglects the fact that global nuclear war is an existential risk. A danger that threatens the existence of all humans cannot be evaluated using standard intuitions about probability. Specifically, one has to engage in anthropic reasoning. What does that mean? That you have to adjust your probability estimates based on the limits to what you can observe while still alive. To analyze this puzzle at the level of civilizations, by the way, thanks for being here. I'm enjoying this. Quite an interesting thread. To analyze this puzzle at the level of civilizations, we have to use complex terminology, e.g. the self-sampling assumption. But we can make the problem intuitive if we describe it at the level of an individual. And let's just have him do that. Imagine you have a friend who engages in reckless activities. For instance, he runs across freeways and plays Russian roulette. I know that some of you know someone like that. He tells you, I haven't died a single time, so I'm confident I'll be safe. The problem with this line of reasoning is obvious. Your friend can't observe any instances where his dangerous gambles kill him. His pool of past experiences is filtered. It's a biased sample since it excludes death as an outcome. We are facing the same problem as a species. Our collective experience excludes scenarios that produce human extinction. By definition, we never get a second chance with them. The first time is the last time. We all die. Does nuclear war qualify as this kind of risk? Yes. There was a period in the late 1980s when scientists began to doubt whether it would actually cause human extinction. It was theorized that nuclear winter might actually be more like nuclear autumn, bad, but survivable. However, the best available computer models now indicate that nuclear winter would be even worse than originally estimated. The sun would be blotted out for years upon years. Most humans would starve to death. But at least we will have shown Putin. Given that a nuclear exchange could eliminate our species, the absence of such an experience in our past is not a surprise. People who invoke the absence of such an exchange to lobby for war with Russia are irresponsible, like your crazy friend who plays Russian roulette. You should tell him to stop that, obviously. Oh yeah, that was the end of the thread. All right, so what we've been looking at here is Clint Ehrlich's thread. The conventional wisdom is that we're headed for a second Cold War with Russia. I disagree. We're flirting with a hot war. It could involve nukes. Billions of people could die. And I would say the key part of this, besides the aggressive rhetoric from the policy world, is this, where was that? This right here. This claim that it's the official policy of the Russian Federation that certain conventional attacks deserve a nuclear response. And that Russia could interpret this policy as allowing it to use nuclear weapons to defend Crimea in response to a successful invasion. So you can let Clint know what you think about that. Go over to his thread, pull it up, like, retweet, share, also in the comments and chat here. Let's see what else we have. By the way, some nice articles that he linked to, like this one. U.S. must prepare for war against Russia over Ukraine. We're going to look at this next. Ignore the hawks. Mr. President, you're right on Ukraine. But I want to, first of all, get this whole thing on screen like that. And second of all, pop over to the chat for a minute. See what's going on there. So let me just see some of these comments in the chat. Where did we leave off? Putin is not going to war. Any war? Why not? What makes you say that? I'm highly anti-war, but there's no evidence that Putin will stop. Fraser came in late, catching up at twice speed. Nice to see you, Fraser. See you, quote unquote. As we discuss Russia, Ukraine, NATO. Soon we'll have Germany on the table. What's going on with neoconservative versus paleoconservative, right? We can always take Curtis Yarvin as our guide. Okay, well, maybe one or two more comments, and then we'll go over to the next article. I don't think Russia will annex eastern Ukraine, but that would bring more trouble unless the U.S. would not intervene. If they will, not only Russia will invade Ukraine, but also China will invade Taiwan. So you probably have seen people characterize the situation we're in as the gravest state of possible war in Europe since you know when. All right, let's go over this article. So we have Amari. Ignore the hawks, Mr. President. You're right on Ukraine. America can't and mustn't go to war with Russia over Ukraine. I'm just going to move that over like so. President Biden stated this inescapable truth at his Wednesday news conference and sent foreign policy hawks into a sputtering rage. Their reaction says more about the hawks' mindless rigidity than it does about Biden's oft-questioned mental acuity. The president was admittedly ineloquent, but he managed to ramble his way to a refreshing realism. He made clear that the U.S. response should be proportional to the magnitude of Moscow's aggression, that we can't guard Europe's frontiers if the major European powers themselves are divided, and that the Kremlin has strongly held concerns about Ukraine joining NATO. The reactions are revealing. Left and right agree on very little these days, but they share a sense that something has gone profoundly wrong with America internally. The two camps disagree over the diagnosis, whether it's structural racism or elite liberalism that's to blame, but the symptoms are apparent to both. Our decrepit infrastructure, the loneliness that haunted young Americans long before social distancing, widespread job and health precarity, addiction, and homelessness. And this isn't even to mention our cultural incohesion, our ability to agree on the most basic facts about our history and identity. Yet the Hawks' always escalate reflex continues to distort national priorities. By the way, just about this, our decrepit infrastructure and all of that, you may have seen a conversation or debate between Moldbug and Mike Anton about how quickly America could collapse or whether it could be in a state of collapse for hundreds of years yet. Curious to know what you think about that. Could American institutions, and let's say, God forbid, okay, but could it happen that the American, we don't hate America here. We want America to flourish, to be strong, to be good, happy, healthy, to have the opposite of all of these things, okay? Strong economy, good health, homes. You don't want young people dying on overdosing and all of that. Okay, but still you have a legitimate question about whether the American regime is collapsing and whether that collapse is going to happen in the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years or 100, 200, 300 years. As Curtis Yarvin argues, the process of collapse can be very slow and drawn out. The work from home MacArthur's blew a predictable gasket. Quote, much of that performance was profoundly disturbing, tweeted National Review's Rich Lowry, especially on Russia. Senator Ted Cruz, Republican from Texas, said the president had shocked the world by giving Putin a green light to invade Russia. The Wall Street Journal editorial page where I used to work linked the West's failure to deter Vladimir Putin to Biden's earlier decision to abandon the Afghanistan war after 2 fruitless decades. Meanwhile, Biden's usual defenders railed at him for inadvertently revealing fundamental truths they would prefer to remain obscure. Yeah. The outrage over Biden's indiscretions, including in Kiev and other European capitals, prompted the White House to issue a statement vowing a swift, severe, and united response in case of a renewed invasion. It's too bad. Biden's posture was perfectly sensible given the political mood in Europe and especially its pivotal power, Germany. It also reflected a deeper wisdom and continuity with his 2 immediate predecessors, that U.S. power is overstretched, exhausted, and battered by domestic polarization and decay. The Hawks are, in essence, asking Team Biden to be more zealous for European security than are Europeans themselves. The fact is that a majority of Europeans are ambivalent at best when it comes to America, NATO, and the Russian threat. A 2020 Pew Research Center survey of populations in 16 key NATO states found that a majority opposes using force to defend a fellow member state in a conflict with Russia. In France, 53% oppose fulfilling the Western Alliance's Article 5 obligations under such a scenario, compared with 41% who'd back military action. More startling still, 60% of Germans oppose using force to defend a fellow member state. Ukraine, of course, isn't even a NATO member. Its territorial claims inspire even less resolve in Europe's core. Biden's statements triggered much grumbling across the Atlantic, but Western Europe's sentiments about Ukraine's inviolable territorial integrity are just that, misty sentiments. This is a bitter reality, but it's a reality reflected in Western Europe's response to the Ukrainian question going back to Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea and stealth invasion of the eastern Donbass region. At various points since, Paris and Berlin resisted economic sanctions against Moscow, on occasion even calling for existing sanctions to be lifted. Meanwhile, Amari continues, Germany has remained determined to push ahead with Nord Stream 2, a natural gas pipeline running from Russia to Germany under the Baltic Sea, thus bypassing Ukraine and Poland, and tightening Moscow's energy stranglehold on the continent. Successive U.S. administrations of both parties begged for a rethink to no avail until Biden dropped the issue last year. Berlin has signaled it might abandon the project if Russia invades Ukraine, maybe. So, is it really crazy that for Biden and the American people, is it really that crazy for Biden and the American people to groan at a supposed duty to police Europe's borders when Europeans have been this indifferent this long? What do you think about that question? Those of you who support Biden's support for Ukraine, who support Biden's sending aid, military aid, personnel, and even getting involved in a military conflict in a more intensified manner. Is that justified, when Europeans have been this indifferent this long? No, it's not crazy for Biden to groan at that duty. It's the height of sanity, according to this argument. What exactly does our deeply divided America stand for abroad? Will a potentially catastrophic confrontation with nuclear-armed Russia over Europe's miserable peripheries, or with nuclear China over the island of Taiwan, address any of our deeper internal crises? By saying no to the hawks, Biden gave the right answers to these questions. The United States has treaty commitments that it must honor, to be sure, but we can't create flashpoints wherever revanchist powers such as Russia, China, and Iran seek to reassert claims within their historic civilizational spheres. Okay, in my opinion, either you acknowledge civilizational spheres and then you begin to think along lines like these, or you acknowledge just the international rules-based order, quote unquote, as we saw in the earlier thread, in which case all talk of civilizational spheres, civilizational spaces, and civilizational states must become anathema. Somehow that's an important dividing line. There has to be at least some attempt at prioritization. For 2 decades, America neglected the internal foundations of its power while pursuing stupid and costly regime change wars in the Middle East and North Africa. Our domestic hearth crumbled. The hawks have much to answer for and no standing to complain about the consequences of their policies. This was this article entitled, "Ignore the Hawks, Mr. President. You're right on Ukraine." Again, thank you to those of you who are here commenting in the chat. In the comments, certainly feel free to stake your position, stake your claim, and you can hash it out. Yeah, that was that article. There's a couple other things I wanted us to look at together. So this one by Douglas Murray, we already read. The Center for European Renewal was referred to. Really no need to go into that. This maybe I'll save for another stream. Psychopathy and the Origins of Totalitarianism by James Lindsay. Curious to know what that's all about. But let's have a look at Der Spiegel. Germany has little maneuvering room in Ukraine conflict. Maybe we'll read 1 or 2 of these articles and then reassess. Let's see what whether I can read this without a subscription. Yeah. Germany has little maneuvering room in Ukraine conflict. The U.S. wants to impose harsh sanctions. The U.S. wants to impose harsh sanctions on Russia invades Ukraine. Come on, guys. Hire an editor. But the German government is putting on the brakes out of fears over the economic consequences and what punitive measures could mean for energy supplies for a country that gets much of its gas from Moscow. To a certain degree, the visit was a conspiratorial one. No photo, no press release, and the first meeting was a small one. William Burns, the head of the CIA, first attended a meeting last week with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and his chief of staff, Wolfgang Schmidt, at the Chancellor's behest. Later, they were joined by Bruno Kahl, the head of Germany's Foreign Intelligence Service, the BND, and staff members from Scholz's chancellery. The head of America's Foreign Intelligence Agency told them bluntly that if Russia attacks Ukraine, the pressure on Berlin to take a clear stand against Moscow will increase. Despite the friendly tone among the participants, it was by no means an easy meeting. Germany and the United States have been far apart on the issue of Russia for the past several weeks. Burns brought a trove of intelligence with him on troop movements and sabotage units to convince Berlin of the U.S. view of the Russia threat. U.S. President Joe Biden also wanted to talk to the Germans and offered Scholz a personal appointment in Washington at short notice. It would have been Scholz's inaugural visit to the U.S. and, more importantly, an opportunity for the 2 leaders to closely coordinate joint steps in the acute threat of war. But Scholz reportedly declined, saying the next few days are already planned with travel and important meetings. Both are now looking for a new date. It's possible the meeting won't take place until the beginning or middle of February. Will it be too late? It's rather difficult to fathom. Russia's building up the biggest threat since the end of the Cold War, deploying around 100,000 troops on the border with Ukraine, stationing tanks, artillery, and rocket launchers. And the German chancellor is unable to clear his schedule to accept an invitation from the American president. What else must happen to trigger a greater sense of urgency in Berlin? Is it not enough that Russian President Vladimir Putin is trying to blackmail the West, issuing ultimatums and threatening military consequences if NATO doesn't rule out Ukrainian membership in the alliance? As if Putin hasn't already shown the world with the occupation of Crimea that he doesn't much care about international law. As if the Baltic states' worries were unfounded that they could face a similar situation to that of eastern Ukraine, where Russian leaders, with the help of loyal separatists, have been sabotaging the sovereignty of the government in Kiev since 2014. Western intelligence agencies and military officials believe the possibility of a Russian invasion is real, but the parties united in the coalition government in Berlin have shown a recent preference for emphasizing what leverage they are not interested in using against Moscow. Excluding Russia from the SWIFT international payment system, not a great idea, they say, because it would also affect the German economy. Weapons deliveries to Ukraine, purportedly incompatible with German arms export guidelines. Putting a stop to Moscow's prestigious Nord Stream 2 pipeline project that could increase direct Russian gas exports to Germany and Europe. Obviously, they have not been reading Darren Beatty's Twitter account. It shouldn't be lumped together with Russia's Ukraine policy, says Kevin Kunert, the Secretary General of the Chancellor's center-left Social Democratic Party. In other words, Germany is not prepared to use any leverage against Moscow, as lamented by this author of the Der Spiegel piece we're reading. It's true that no one knows exactly what Putin's goal is right now, whether he's trying to gain ground diplomatically with the help of military threats, or if he's planning a military operation under the pretext of a lack of concessions from the West. Within Chancellor Scholz's SPD, there's a strong tendency to downplay the threat of war. Many within the SPD, but also within the Green Party, share the Kremlin's opinion that Russia had been deceived during the eastward expansion of NATO and the European Union. Still, the Germans' wavering course weakens the strategy of Berlin's Western allies, a strategy aimed at driving the price of a military attack as high as possible, as one EU official puts it. And the window of opportunity to deter Putin could close soon, one senior NATO diplomat told Der Spiegel. Once Putin had made the decision to attack Ukraine internally, he would hardly be able to back down without weakening his domestic political position, the diplomat says. That's why it's crucial for the EU, the US, and NATO to act as united and resolutely as possible. Any hesitation could be interpreted by the Russian president as a signal that he can take the next step. Let's see what we have here. Confrontational Greens. Question: what should the German government's fundamental approach in its response to Russia be? Percent of respondents saying confrontational, according to party preference. The Greens are just trigger happy here, itching to go to war with Russia. And as you see, all the way down at the bottom, the Alternative for Deutschland, much less willing to have a confrontation with Russia. The message from Washington, meanwhile, is that deterrence only works if you don't take any options off the table. The Americans' view is that these options include arms deliveries to Ukraine and the threat of maximal sanctions. And if you want to see a statement of that, go to Foreign Affairs magazine. Whoops. Don't need the advertising version of it. Go to Foreign Affairs and you can read The Day After Russia Attacks, what war in Ukraine would look like and how America should respond, by Alexander Vindman and Dominic Cruz-Bustelos. And there you will read the American case for arms deliveries, sanctions, and much more besides. But the German government is tapping the brakes on both fronts. On Monday, German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock traveled to Kiev. Since taking office, Baerbock says nothing has taken as much of her attention as Ukraine's security, before once again ruling out arms deliveries of any kind to her Ukrainian hosts. For now, Baerbock isn't prepared to break with Green Party principles in the way that Green Party Joschka Fischer did back when he was foreign minister and dared to back the German military deployment to Kosovo. Germany's restrictive arms policy is well known, said Baerbock, who is also co-chair of the Green Party. Sorry if any of the pronunciation is off. I don't change my position based on where I am at the moment, she said. It's an issue that divides the party. On the one hand, the Greens arose out of peace movements. It's part of their founding myth. On the other, you have a Green politician like Robert Habeck, who was calling for defensive weapons deliveries to Ukraine as far back as May. I think it's hard to deny Ukraine weapons for defense, for self-defense, the party co-chair told German public radio station Deutschlandfunk at the time. He had reportedly coordinated his comments with other foreign policy politicians, but resistance was strong. Jürgen Tritten, a veteran Green member of parliament, said the proposal would contradict the principle of not delivering weapons to war zones. Okay, again, we're reading this Der Spiegel article. At the moment, it's talking about factions within the Green Party as to whether or not they want to support Ukraine with armaments and things like that. Tritten has since become the foreign policy point man for his parliamentary group. but nothing has changed in terms of his categorical rejection of arms deliveries. You can let me know if you want in the chat, in the comments, do you support your country's giving arms deliveries to Ukraine in the case of a Russian incursion or Russian invasion? My government of Canada, I think, has given Ukraine a $120 million loan for the purpose and is involved in other ways. He told Der Spiegel that the entire German government considers arms deliveries to Ukraine to be a mistake. Moreover, he says there's no distinction between defensive and offensive weapons. You shouldn't fool yourselves or others about that. Let's have a look at this threatening deployment, the Russian military in areas near the Ukrainian border and surroundings. A total of 100,000 Russian troops are thought to be stationed near the border with Ukraine. And here you have Donetsk and Lugansk, areas controlled by separatists loyal to Moscow. Now, I'm extremely, extremely far from being an expert on these topics. Okay, I'm a layman like most of the rest of you, I think. But I do want to share with you just about this map something that you may find interesting, not vouching for the credibility of the information, just telling you what it is. There's a Russian journalist, regime propagandist, if you prefer. His name is Vladimir Solovyov. He's got a show, for example, called Voskresny Вечер, Sunday evening. And he's got a radio show, okay, very famous Russian journalist. And on his radio show yesterday, which I listened to a little bit of, he had, what's the guy's name? DNR, whoops, hold on. DNR, Donetsk, Pushilin, I think is the guy's name. Is that it? Yeah, Denis Pushilin has served as the Donetsk People's Republic head of state since 2018. So you go over here. Where are we? Go over here. You see Donetsk, Lugansk. Okay, so Donetsk is ruled by Denis Pushilin, who's the head of state since 2018. And this guy, Denis Pushilin, pictured here, was on he was on Vladimir Solovyov's radio show yesterday, and Solovyov asked him, where are Ukrainian forces? So we have these reports about Russian forces being stationed, and you see that that's what's depicted in this image. What we don't see is where are Ukrainian forces. You may be able to infer something about Ukraine's perception of the situation if you could have here a picture of Ukraine's forces. So in that interview, and by the way, you probably could find a map with something like that on it. I'm just riffing based on what we see here. In that interview, he said that surprisingly, you have more Ukrainian forces, maybe not necessarily surprisingly, but he said, for example, there were more Ukrainian forces massed here than here. And in the strategic analysis of Mr. Pushilin and Mr. Solovyov in that conversation, it seemed unlikely that Ukraine would be preparing for a proper Russian invasion if they were leaving some important territories like Kharkiv unprotected. Anyways, you get the idea. Okay, so hopefully that's something for you to consider. Hannah Neumann, back to the article, a Green member of the European Parliament, on the other hand, argues that supplies of protective equipment could definitely be negotiated in the event of a Russian attack. But before we discuss defensive weapons, we first need to know what Ukraine specifically wants, she told Der Spiegel. Sergei Lagondinsky, also a member of the European Parliament from the party, Green Party, is more forceful. We can't be the neutral arbiter when one country unilaterally threatens another. He says the only way to avoid military escalation is to credibly demonstrate that there will be consequences. You can do that with help for self-defense, such as defensive weapons. So a big question. To what extent is Germany going to support Ukraine with weapons and other kinds of support? And to what extent are they going to, as we saw in that phrase earlier, I'm not going to be able to find my way back, but to what extent are they not interested in using the leverage that they have against Russia? Okay, big and important question. Russia's threats have also triggered a debate within the other junior government coalition partner in Berlin, the business-friendly Free Democratic Party. As recently as January 11th, this FDP chair of the Defense Committee in the Bundestag, Germany's federal parliament, attempted to skirt the thorny issue by pointing to the coalition agreement of the previous government, led by the conservative Christian Democrats. In that agreement, the coalition parties agreed to rule out weapons deliveries to crisis areas, and Ukraine is one of them. Okay, again, whatever country you're from, if you want to say in the chat, if you want to say in the comments, what do you think? And on the basis of what reasoning do you think it? should your countries be providing military support to Ukraine in the case of a Russian invasion, incursion, or as a deterrent force in advance of a Russian invasion or incursion. Now, though, fewer than 10 days later, Strack-Zimmerman no longer sounds quite as firm. She's now calling for the consideration of defensive weapons for Ukraine. Things change pretty quickly in the heat of the moment. Still, there isn't yet a clear discernible position within the FDP. Alexander Lambsdorff, the party's foreign policy expert in parliament, says weapons deliveries are prohibited by the War Weapons Control Act, so they have a legal barrier. He also has difficulty with the concept of defensive weapons. Doesn't everybody? If you look at the history of military conflict, he points out these weapons could also be used for other purposes as well. He does say, however, that he supports deliveries of protective vests, helmets, and night vision equipment to Ukraine. But another FDP foreign policy expert, I apologize to those of you who are here if this is too much in the weeds. I just thought it'd be interesting to see what they're writing about in Der Spiegel about Russia-Ukraine. But another FDP foreign policy expert, Jir Sarai, who recently became the party's designated Secretary General, wants to at least discuss the possibility of arms deliveries. A realistic foreign policy also includes putting all options on the table, or you can also say that a realistic foreign policy has to be willing to suspend at times even legal prohibitions. The strongest calls for arms deliveries come from the conservative CDU. It's a little strange, though, considering that the Christian Democrats proved quite reserved on the issue when they were still the governing party until late last year. Johan Vadeful, however you say that, the party's deputy whip in parliament, says the previous position of rejecting arms deliveries to Kiev is no longer tenable in view of the situation. The CDU's foreign policy expert Hart believes Germany needs to send more than just bandages. Okay, they should definitely put their dog in the fight. Even incoming CDU party chair Friedrich Merz advocates giving consideration to arms deliveries to Ukraine. Ukraine's ambassador to Germany, Melnik, who has long conveyed his government's arms request to Berlin, is pleased with the direction the debate in the German capital is taking. We welcome the CSU's change of heart on this vital issue for Kiev. Well, naturally, he would, as well as initial calls to break taboos within the government coalition, especially the FDP, Melnik says. The supply of protective equipment alone would be merely a symbolic gesture. What Ukraine urgently needs, he says, are robust defensive weapons for effective defense against a large-scale military attack by Russia and as the only serious deterrent to Putin. Okay, so for many people who are viewing the situation in this light, that's what's at stake. That's the option. Either you provide deterrent force to Ukraine, or you risk the undermining of the quote-unquote rules-based international order and the return of civilizational spheres of influence. Despite the debate among the Greens and the FDP, the German government has so far shown no inclination to respond to Kiev's demands for weapons. This is mainly due to the SPD. Arms deliveries could be seen as contributing to the escalation, etc., not to mention the historical implications in which German weapons would be used against Russia for the first time since World War II. But Germany's allies are not going to allow Berlin to get off that easily. With the chancellor having ruled out a quick trip to Washington, Biden dispatched Blinken to Berlin on Thursday. So let's do the full phrase here. Secretary of State Antony Blinken to Berlin on Thursday. Like the CIA director before him, he brought along an unmistakable message. If Berlin is going to take a special path and not supply weapons, then the Germans should at least participate in tough financial and economic sanctions if Putin strikes. But as we saw earlier, Germany does not seem inclined to do that. Russia has a choice between two paths, Blinken said at an event held by the Atlantic Brück, a think tank that promotes transatlantic dialogue. One is a path to diplomacy that can lead to peace and security. The other is a path of aggression that will only lead to conflict, severe consequences, international condemnation. Yeah. American diplomats always putting Russia between two paths. Be America or face our wrath. Bow before America or face our wrath. Sell out your interests or face our wrath. Okay, so there's a question about the way that American statesmanship and foreign policy and geopolitical policy has conducted itself towards Russia. Maybe you think, who cares? If you can, then you do. And if you can't, then you suffer what you must and all of that. But anybody who knows Russia knows that you don't put Russia between two paths like this unless you want to foster their justified reaction. Publicly, the German government emphasizes close coordination with the United States. If Russia takes military action against Ukraine, and by the way, nobody wants to see anybody lose their lives recklessly, okay, because some government has taken preposterous steps in international relations and acted in a blundering manner geopolitically. But it's always going to be the case that there are people who get trampled, and God forbid that should happen. Hopefully cooler heads prevail and the statesmanship can be competent. If Russia takes military action against Ukraine, it will pay a high price, Foreign Minister Baerbock says to almost every camera. But, because you know what happens when the cameras are off, even if it's the intelligence agencies filming, but there are different opinions among allies about what that price should be. Financial sanctions must be closely examined, Baerbock said during her American counterpart's visit. She said it wasn't a question of finding the sanctions that sounded the toughest, but about those sanctions that really have an effect, and not against oneself, but against Russia. Because you're not going to punish Russia by shooting yourself in the foot. I haven't even checked the chat or anything, guys. I'm sorry, I'm just going through this article. I'll return to that briefly. For example, the articles, briefly when we're through this, the allies are discussing the possibility of excluding Russia from the SWIFT international payment system, a move that would virtually cut Moscow off from the global market and was originally proposed by the US and UK. This is the ultimate economic sanction, German economics minister Habeck told Der Spiegel in an interview. He said it would hit Russia hard, but also Germany, a point that experts in his ministry have not tired of pointing out. And you know that necessity is the mother of invention. And you can see, those of you who really follow this question carefully, if Russia is cut off from the SWIFT international payment system and it gets pushed into the system that it has or is developing with China and other alternative systems, play that out. What does that mean for the future of the SWIFT system? What does it mean for financial multipolarity and all of that? And what is the status of the Russia-China economic cooperation in financial monetary markets that excludes US and its allies? Some of you may know about that. It'd be nice if you could put it in the chat or in the comments. Excluding Moscow from SWIFT would bring all payments between Russia and German companies to a halt. This includes loans that companies service with banks in their respective countries. But what worries Berlin the most is the possible loss of energy supplies to Germany, payments for which are also made via SWIFT. So you had the Nord Stream 2 argument above. And as you see, that implies this SWIFT international payment system as well, because it's through that system that Germany pays for its energy supplies. It's also questionable how quickly alternatives could be found. Russia covered 55% of Germany's natural gas needs in 2020. In theory, Germany could also obtain supplies of liquefied natural gas from the US, Africa, or the Middle East. There is gas available, but there are no German port terminals where the LNG tankers could dock. They would have to go through plants in the Netherlands, Poland, or Italy. Besides, there are massive environmental doubts about gas that come from fracking, and it is also very expensive. As far as sanctions are concerned, Berlin is under economic constraints and its room for maneuver is narrow. This is probably one of the reasons that Economics Minister Habeck, whose ministry is also responsible for sanctions, is opposed to cutting off Russian access to SWIFT. Okay, again, Berlin is under economic constraints itself. It's not like it is holding all the cards and can do what it wants. Habeck also doesn't want to put the emphasis on confrontation. Instead, he told Der Spiegel, we should think about new areas of business that can help us lead both sides out of the confrontational role. Obviously, too cooperative of a mindset for the anti-Russian hawks. What the economics minister has in mind is economic cooperation, also with Russia. Quoting, naturally, Russia has potential for hydrogen, for wind power, Habeck said, with an eye to supplies of green hydrogen. It should be clear to the Russian regime, Russia has a lot to lose by going to war, and it can win by withdrawing its troops and de-escalating, the vice chancellor said. Such an approach would provide a pathway for Russia to continue earning money from energy exports, even if Germany, as it aims for climate neutrality, was to cease purchases of natural gas in the coming decades. It seems doubtful, however, whether such a long-term economic project is enough to get the Kremlin to abandon its short-term plans for Ukraine. Germany's coalition government also hasn't reached agreement on Putin's prestige project, the Nord Stream 2 natural gas pipeline under the Baltic Sea. The Greens and the FDP have long been opposed to the pipeline, but the SPD has consistently defended the project in the face of criticism from the US and numerous Eastern European countries. In the coalition agreement, the parties elected to merely refer to European energy law and to leave the decision up to certification authorities, but there likely isn't enough time left for that route. The situation on the Ukrainian border with Russia is forcing the German government to make a decision. The US is insisting that the pipeline, Nord Stream 2, be part of any package of sanctions, with Washington invoking an agreement made last summer between then German Chancellor Angela Merkel and US President Joe Biden. Gas is not flowing through Nord Stream 2 yet, which means the pipeline is leverage for Germany, the United States, and our allies, not Russia, said US Secretary of State Antony Blinken at a Thursday press conference in Berlin following a meeting with his German counterpart, Baerbock. But prominent Social Democrats are trying to thwart the arrangement, a discussion triggered by SPD General Secretary Kunert at a press conference last week, where he insisted it's time to finally put an end to the bickering over Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Guys, you can say, are you in camp Darren Beattie that Nord Stream 2 is happening? Or do you think that Nord Stream 2 pipeline can still be treated as leverage for Germany, the United States, and their allies, can still be part of a package of sanctions, can still be paused or stopped? Speaking of a certain obsession held by some to cancel projects that have always been a thorn in the side, he then said he was deeply opposed to fueling potential international crises through overwrought rhetoric. What's with the Union Jack? That was the moment the SPD found itself facing a serious communications problem alongside the challenges of arriving at a common position. Pragmatists within the SPD were appalled by Kunert's naivety, while those further to the left in the party, such as Rolf Stegner, warned of saber rattling. And the debate in the party just kept going. The only ones who didn't contribute were party co-leaders, these two people. The scuttlebutt in Berlin is that neither was particularly pleased by Kunert's comments, but they didn't say so publicly. The debate over Nord Stream 2, whether it's on the table or not on the table, and sanctions and related kinds of gestures, is especially sensitive for Klingbeil. He only took up his leadership role in December. One might think the debate over Russia would be an excellent opportunity for him to raise his profile. Okay, I'm going to skip that. Actually, no, it's going. Russia would be an excellent opportunity for him to raise his profile. He's not entirely unbiased on the issue. He's friends with both ex-Chancellor Schroeder, who's chairman of the board of the company that operates the already finished Nord Stream 1 pipeline. I guess that'll have some effect on his outlook. And with Kunert. If he were to support Kunert, it would be an affront against Chancellor Scholz and vice versa. So he's hardly said anything at all, with the exception of a podcast that he recorded with Kunert about 2 weeks ago. I simply have no desire for war, he said flippantly. He's not one to defend the Russian approach, he said, by adding that he strenuously rejects it. Quote, but it's simply not enough to just say everything the Russians do is stupid. News alert to American government, American media, and American analysts. It's simply not enough to say everything the Russians do is stupid. That would be a pretty breakthrough discovery, I think, for the Americans to learn. The party is now planning on discussing the issue internally, and there's talk of working groups and coordination committees, but there likely isn't enough time for such a process. You know, I think my opinion has been clear over the years in different ways at different times that the United States can defend its national interests, of course, its international interests, of course, its spheres of influence and its rules-based order and all of that without being nagli, for the Russian speakers, without being so, without looking down on Russians as niederludi, as insufficiently civilized, as backwards, as savage, as stupid, and all of that. In fact, maybe I'll tell you my favorite little anecdote about General McMaster at the Atlantic Council, something he said in his parting speech, that as somebody who understands Russia a little bit, possibly a little tiny little bit more than people who have no exposure to Russian language, Russian thought, and Russian families, found so stupid, so distasteful, and so beneath the dignity of American diplomacy that I was embarrassed for all involved. Anyways, let's go back to the article. The party is now planning on discussing the issue internally, and there is talk of working groups and coordination committees, but there likely isn't enough time for such a process. Okay, anyway, you have a crisis, and you have all of these differences in the parties about whether or not they're going to go hard on Russia, whether or not they're going to put Nord Stream 2 at stake. So Scholz has consistently tapped the brakes when demands have surfaced to put a stop to Nord Stream 2. He's in Darren Beattie's camp here that it is going to happen. It is happening. Just recently, he answered a question as to whether the Russian-German pipeline was a private economic venture, and he said yes. In doing so, he was supporting a position that his predecessor, Merkel, had realized was untenable. I don't want to keep reading that. We're pretty close to the end. We got a sense of it, okay? Is Nord Stream 2 defensible or not? Will Germany protect its economic, strategic, geopolitical interests to the extent that they hinge on Nord Stream? Or will it put all of that at stake in order to oppose, quote unquote, Russian aggression? I didn't realize that was a pretty long article. Okay, that got us into the weeds of German politics, German political parties. But guess what? The weeds is where a lot of this stuff happens. Okay, it's where a lot of the important decisions, disagreements, and a lot of what's at stake will take place. So this is Der Spiegel. You can just search it, Spiegel International, and you'll see many, many articles that you can read here. Ukraine crisis, NATO insiders, fear attack on multiple fronts. Party goes on in Kiev despite fears of war, etc. I think that's enough for us for Der Spiegel, and that may just be enough for us altogether. Let me check in who's here, who's doing what. I said Foreign Affairs has some articles you can read as well. I think it's got a little spotlight here on Russia and Ukraine. People taking different positions. One here, Ukraine is part of the West. NATO and EU should treat it that way. Another, Russia seeks to stop NATO's expansion. And Dmitry Trenin really defends Putin's legitimacy in claiming that NATO's expansion ought to stop. What will it take to deter Russia? So this is a big, big question, and you should definitely spend some time looking into all of it. Those of you who are here, thank you for being here. I think I'll probably pause this stream. Let me just spend a minute or two over in the chat. And then we'll part ways. What do we have here in the chat? Hold on. Whoops. Yeah. Why don't we just do it like this? Okay, I don't care if the West sells Ukraine weapons. Just don't expect anyone to go into a shooting war on their behalf, writes Lavitz Boss. Nice to see you again. Also, an interesting question and an astute observation. One that we must have missed up here. James, this really shows the brilliance of the Kremlin's position. Just by massing troops on the border, they can kick EU NATO into action and expose the fissures, and obtain business proposals if they magnanimously back down. Yeah, commenting on what we just read in the Der Spiegel article, and don't go through with an invasion they never intended on. I would say Putin's definitely holding the cards, okay? And as you read these articles and analyses, you'll be left with your own view about that. Lavitz, these tactics the USA uses on foreign adversaries are always used on their domestic population. So if they're talking about blocking SWIFT on Russia, how long before they ban Mike Lindell, the MyPillow guy, from using SWIFT? Fraser, is it time preference which enables Putin to ask in terms of real politics? His foreign opponents are always chasing their tails with elections. Henry Walker asking about another YouTube channel for geopolitics, so you can check that out. Follow up on that another time. Fraser, the West needs power either through new gas pipelines, Russia, or from nuclear. Nuclear, they need Kazakhstan brought into the Western sphere. Henry with a super chat, I appreciate that. Have I ever read Origins and Doctrines of Fascism by Giovanni Gentile? I haven't read it. I've read some of Gentile on fascism and some about Gentile and fascism, but I have not read the Origins and Doctrines of Fascism. I don't think I have. But again, thanks for the super chat. Thanks for the question. And I do recommend that people consider right Hegelianism when they're studying their political theory and not just typical Marxist left Hegelianism. The irony of the state invoking emergency powers of the sovereign exception to defend states that the globalist elites at the state's helm want to eventually destroy. Anyway, Gandalf points out, okay, some comments on the Christian Democrats in Germany since that article got into the details. American media calling weapons lethal aid. German Greens being warmongers, nothing new. They were on board with the Afghanistan war back in 2011. So guys, if there are other articles that you have come up that you think are particularly on point, that are good, that are interesting, that get into a nice analysis, I bookmark these articles, and then when it's time for me to read a bunch of them, I like to do it together with you. So thank you for your comments. Thanks for being here. I appreciate it. And we might do another one of these later today. I'll see what else I can find. Clint Ehrlich's thread was a good one. Okay. Good people on Twitter. Follow them, support them. And take it easy, everybody. Nice seeing you. Goodbye until the next stream.